join deploy and on the back-end processing team. Much of his time at the company has been spent implementing data transformations for high accuracy maps. So, turn it over to Ben.
Thanks a lot. Hey everyone, I hope you're having a great GIS day. As she said, I'm Ben Schuller. I'm a geospatial software engineer at Drone Deploy. I've been fascinated by computers for a long time and have grown up around GIS my whole life. In fact, my dad, Sean Schuller, who many of you may know, is the GIS program director for Indiana. So, when I started looking for internships in college, GIS was a pretty natural fit, and I quickly found myself loving it too. Today, I'll be talking about continental drift, datum transformations, and how they're applicable to most everyone that works in GIS. If you haven't heard of Drone Deploy, we're a reality capture platform. I work on the processing team, which handles most of the in-the-weeds GIS work that we do. My primary focus is on the drone mapping side of our business. You can use our app to fly your drone, have it take a bunch of still images, upload them, and we'll stitch them in to a 3D model, an orthomosaic, DTM, point cloud, and some other products as well. Our maximum resolution at Drone Deploy is zoom level 24, which is about 1 centimeter per pixel. At this resolution, the small details really start to matter. However, regular GPS is only accurate down to a couple of meters, which presents some problems when you're going for centimeter level accuracy. This inaccuracy with regular GPS is mostly due to atmospheric conditions and distortions. Because of that, people have come up with some creative solutions to make their maps more accurate. The concept of ground control points, or GCPs, has been around since the 70s when NASA started the Landsat program. This involved placing markers on the ground, as you can see there, which are visible from the air. Then, these points are surveyed, and their locations are recorded. When Drone Deploy processes the images into a map, Drone Deploy will do its best to locate these ground control points in each of the source images, and then you confirm that those are in the right locations, and then we can much more accurately geo-reference the final results. GCPs have the advantage of being the most accurate of the high accuracy mapping methods we'll talk about, and they work anywhere on Earth. No need for special base stations or anything like that. However, they have the downside of being pretty labor intensive. You've got to have a surveyor to go out there and manually shoot the points, and that's labor intensive and expensive. Additionally, they're quite error prone due to a variety of reasons, some of which we'll dive into today. The other two high accuracy methods that we commonly use are RTK and PPK. RTK stands for real-time kinematic, and PPK stands for post-processing kinematic. Both of these are achieved by attaching a little hat you can see there to your drone. While there are plenty of intricacies and differences between RTK and PPK, for the purposes of this presentation, they're pretty similar. RTK works by correcting the raw GPS points of the images taken from the drone in real time, whereas PPK makes these corrections after the fact, both according to the readings from a network of base stations. In the US, we're lucky enough to have access to the CORS network, which some may be familiar with. This consists of a collection of continuously operating reference stations across the country, which have known positions. One of these, pictured here, is pretty close to the Indianapolis airport, and it's mounted on the side of a building, which is a bit out of view. Now, using the differences between where we know these base stations are, they're not moving, and where the GPS says that there are, we can interpolate, and using a few different base stations like this, we can interpolate how far off and how much the drone's GPS needs to be adjusted. RTK and PPK both have the advantage of being pretty easy to use, and all the drone pilot has to do in most cases is tap a couple buttons before they lift off, and that's it. You got high accuracy. However, they can be sometimes less accurate than GCPs, and they have limited geographic ability. We're pretty lucky in the US to have such a built-out set of stations, but places like Australia, where population is a lot more spread out, they have a so-called PPK slow zone, where PPK will not work so well. So that makes things tricky. Now, when you use high accuracy methods like this, you can get really accurate and very well-aligned maps, like we see here, across different dates and times. And this alignment, having things really line up well like this, is key for making measurements across time and comparing cut-fill analysis and construction, or looking at stockpile volumes in mining operations. But despite flying maps with these high accuracy methods, we started to notice some misalignment between maps, like you see here. We mainly observed this misalignment in two different situations. First, when customers would fly a map with GCPs one day, and then RTK or PPK the next day. The second situation is when customers would fly RTK or PPK, but years apart. Now, why would this be? To learn why, we need to take a step back and look at the Earth itself. Flat Earth, of course. At least I wish it was. It would sure make my job easier. But instead, we have this beautiful blue marble, which happens to be very much still alive and moving. So some of you may have heard of Pangea. As it turns out, way back when, all the continents were connected, all bunched together like you see here. Fast forward a few 100 million years, and now they're all separate continents, all drifted apart. Most of us would like to think that the ground we're standing on right now is not moving, but this simply isn't the case. Even today, the continents are still moving. Looking at the ground we're standing on right now in Indianapolis, it moves around 1.5 centimeters per year. And over on the west coast, we see that it's moving almost 2 centimeters per year. And interestingly, the whole tectonic plate is rotating as well. Australia, on the other hand, is moving significantly faster. Depending on where you are, it's moving 6 or 7 centimeters per year. Now, sure, 6 or 7 centimeters might seem pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things. After all, what's a few centimeters here and there? Well, say you're working on a 10-year-long highway project. All of a sudden, that 6 centimeters turns into more than half a meter or a couple feet. You wouldn't want your highway to be a couple feet misaligned, would you? At Drone Deploy, we have this internal tool here, and we've got a layer to show the tectonic plates, so we can much more easily visualize where our plates are. You can see the North American plate is pretty big up here, and Australia's got one down here. There's all sorts of different plates everywhere. These red zones are places where the plate is not supported in ITRF 2014, but we'll talk more about that later. And then also, there's this nifty map that I found, provided by JPL. And each of these green dots is a reference station. And then the yellow line is a vector showing how far that reference station moves. You can see some decent movement in the US, but if we pan over to Australia and some up in Europe and all that, you see some pretty significant movement there, just as we'd expect. So, to understand what's going on, we'll have to talk about datums. Yes, that annoying thing that nobody likes to talk about. But stay with me, please. At a high level, datums are simply things that we can measure off of. For example, if we were measuring the locations of these chairs relative to this podium, we would consider the podium to be a datum. Not so scary after all. In GIS, we mainly have two types of datums, static and dynamic. In a nutshell, static datums are tied to a specific tectonic plate, such as the North American plate. Dynamic datums, on the other hand, are tied to the center of the Earth and aren't tied to a specific plate. Now, if there's one thing I'd like for people to take away from this talk, it's that not all latitude and longitude coordinate pairs are in WGS 84. WGS 84 is just one example of a datum, but there are many more that use latitude and longitude as their axes. In fact, you should pretty much never use WGS 84 if you have a choice in the matter. This is because WGS 84 is rather poorly defined and has a built-in inaccuracy of 1 to 2 meters. With that being said, one example of a static datum that I guess most people in the room are familiar with is NAD 83 2011. This stands for the North American Datum of 1983, specifically the 2011 realization, or version of it. It's tied to the North American tectonic plate and based on the cores network that we discussed earlier. An example of a dynamic datum is WGS 84, but also ITRF 2014, which is tied to the center of the Earth. This is a common, more well-defined datum than WGS 84, and primarily what's used by RTK and PPK. A critical thing to understand about static datums is that the coordinates of an unchanging place do not move over time. Say, for example, we find the location of this podium with reference to the building, and we also find the location of the podium with reference to the whole of Indianapolis. Now, say we pick the whole building up and move it over a couple blocks. The building in this example is our tectonic plate. Now, the coordinates for the podium, when measured off of the building, won't change. The podium is still in the same place as far as the building is concerned. But relative to Indianapolis, those coordinates would change. So, when we compare the latitude and longitude coordinates, which these were captured just a couple days ago, of this base station over by the airport, we see that there's more than a 1 meter difference between them. This creates some big problems when we're talking about centimeter level accuracy. So, with all that being said, this misalignment is starting to make more sense, and we realize that there are two main issues on our hands. A map with GCPs surveyed in NAD 83 2011 won't line up with another map captured in RTK or PPK, which are reported in a dynamic datum unless we consider and account for this difference. Likewise, two RTK and PPK or PPK flights, both of them captured in a dynamic datum, captured years apart, won't line up due to the continental drift. To sum it up, the problems are when we're trying to align data from two different datums, or when we're trying to align data from two different times within the same dynamic data. So, suddenly, it isn't just enough to know where the data is, but we also have to know when the data is. This is crucial to working with high accuracy data across different datums and times. To represent this time component, we have the so-called epoch, or epoch. The epoch simply describes the time at which a measurement was made. So, let's break this down. Epochs are typically represented with an @ symbol following the name of the data. For example, an RTK map flown today would be an ITRF 2014 at 2024.886. ITRF is the International Terrestrial Reference Frame, and 2014 is the version of it. It's important to note that 2014 is not the epic. Our epic, instead, would be 2024.886. This may look scary, but it's just the decimal representation of today's date. Today is the 325th day of the year, meaning that we're 88.6% of the way through the year, hence the 0.886. Epics are typically only used when talking about dynamic datums. This is because, as we mentioned, the same point measured at different times in a static datum will have the same coordinates, since we're measuring off of a tectonic plate. Being a global company, Drone Deploy has to handle data in any number of different datums or times seamlessly. A customer here in the US might upload a map with GCPs in NAT83 2011, and then upload another map flown with RTK with coordinates in ITRF 2014 at mission being when they flew the mission, which is a dynamic datum. So how do we reconcile all of this at Drone Deploy? For this project, we've chosen the name Datum Harmonization to describe this process. To handle this, Drone Deploy shifts everything to one harmonized datum. For us, we've picked ITRF 2014 at 2010. 2010 being the epic. 2010 is rather arbitrary. However, it just so happens to be the default or reference epic of ITRF 2014, hence why we picked it. So, if you upload your regular images with GCPs in a static datum, they're going to get transformed to ITRF 2014 at 2010. If you upload your PPK or RTK images in ITRF 2014 at mission, we're going to transform that and simulate the continental drift in reverse and kind of rewind it to what it looked like or where those coordinates were in ITRF 2014 at 2010. And likewise, if you upload GIS or CAD drawings, shapefiles, what have you, in a static datum, they're going to get transformed back to ITRF 2014 to 2010. And that's how we store everything. By converting everything to this common datum and epic, we can handle all of this mismatching. So, I've got a little demo here to show you what this all looks like in practice. This is our platform. And zoom in a little bit here. We've got a few maps. And we'll first look at the GCPs, and we can put it in the compare mode here and slide between them. So if we move over to this parking lot here, and we slide back and forth, you can see there's a pretty significant misalignment going on here. And that's a deal breaker if you're trying to do measurements over time and things like that. That creates some big issues. However, as you might expect, since RTK and PPK are both flown in a dynamic datum, these maps, even before datum harmonization, line up perfectly. And these RTK and PPK were flown on the same day. Actually, they might be the same flight even. Now, if we look at what this looks like after datum harmonization, we select our GCP map, hop over to compare, zoom in on our parking lot again. So we've got GCPs on the left and RTK on the right. And if we slide back and forth, they're pretty much perfectly aligned. This is so satisfying for me to see after months of work. But we've done it, right? Not quite. So once we implemented all this, we realized, well, NAT83 2011 works great for GCPs, but when we upload GCPs in a different version or realization of NAT83, we're seeing some problems. So here we've got a map with GCPs in NAT83, just base NAT83, and we'll compare it to our NAT83 2011 GCPs. Now in this specific case, it's not a huge misalignment, but depending on where you are in the country and the different, there's all sorts of factors, this can be more exaggerated. And obviously, you know, if you're doing the thing and using static datums for your GCPs, you want it all to work, right? That's the whole point. So why wasn't it working? This took us a little while to track down. But this is the part that's relevant to state GIS specifically. Now you may say, I only work with static datums such as NAT83. And I never have to use dynamic datums like ITRF 2014 or WGS 84, thank God. So we're getting there. There are different realizations of NAT83. We've got NAT83 2011, NAT83, NAT83 HARM, NAT83 NSRS 2007, and maybe one I'm missing. But in any case, there's lots of different room for confusion. So PROJ is, some of you may have heard of it, but it's the open source coordinate transformation library. As this diagram shows, PROJ is what underpins most of the open source GIS ecosystem, and Drone Deploy is all an open source GIS shop, including tools you have probably heard of, like QGIS or GDAL. A handful of years ago, PROJ added support for these kinematic transformations that we need to use. These made it possible for Drone Deploy to do most of this project to begin with. However, there were still some missing pieces like the NAT83 differences that we discussed. So, if you've ever used QGIS, you've probably seen a dialog that looks like this when you try to drag in a raster or something like that. And what it's asking is for you to select the transformer you'd like to use. So depending on the source and destination coordinate system that you're working with, there will be different transformers that you can use. ArcGIS also has a very similar list of transformations that you can pick from. And most people just ignore this and hit OK and get on with their life. And that's fine, but these, I mean, depending on what you're doing, it's fine. Each of these transformers has varying levels of accuracy. And many tools will simply pick the first one automatically, like GDAL. So that makes things tricky to really understand what's going on under the hood. Now, to understand what all this is and how this works, we have to look at the pipelines that PROJ defines. So a pipeline in PROJ is a series of steps that transforms points from one coordinate system to another. And this is what they look like. It looks scary, but it's not too bad, I promise. You can see this first line, we simply say, this is a PROJ pipeline. The next step there is a unit conversion from degrees to radians. Pretty simple. By the way, this is an old, like, base NAT83 Indiana East feet US to ITRF 2014 transformer. And then the next step, we do transverse Mercator projection to project our coordinate system with the GRS 80 ellipsoid. And then from there, and all of these numbers basically are the parameters specifying how to transform that. And then we do another unit conversion to go from meters, which is the output of our transverse Mercator, over to US feet. So that's all fine and dandy, but it doesn't take tectonic shift or continental drift into account. So if we take a look at the transformer from NAT83 2011, Indiana East State Plane, to ITRF 2014, we see it's quite a bit longer and more detailed. The important nugget in here, though, is this Helmert step we see here, and specifically these DRX, DRY, DRZ parameters. That is what takes the continental drift into account. Having that is really critical for doing these datum transformations. So, looking back at our plain old NAD83 transformation again, we see there's no Homer transform in there, and therefore it's rather underdefined. I mean, it'll get you close, but not close enough. So, to understand what's going on here, the North American plates move in a pretty predictable manner. They're not doing anything too crazy. But in some places like New Zealand, this isn't the case. They've got all kinds of earthquakes down there, and the earthquakes move the continents. So GIS folks have come up with this solution of transformation grids, which are basically raster files, and each point on the raster describes how the coordinates should be transformed. And in the case of New Zealand, there's a grid for each earthquake that happens, specifying how the earthquake has shifted things. So these grid files are often used in combination with the Helmer transformations that we talked about earlier. Well, it turns out that the kind folks over at the National Geodetic Survey knew that this whole NAD and NAD83, NAD27, NAD83 2011 mismatch was an issue. And back in 2016, they created a set of these transformation grids, allowing us to go accurately to and from NAD27 and the different realizations of NAD83. These are known as the NADCON5 grids, and are arguably one of the cooler names that the government has come up with. So let's take a look at the transformer that we would have used to go from NAD83 to NAD83 2011, both in the Indiana GIS Day Conference. If you look at the first one, before NADCON5, there's not much there. We are basically just saying a no-op, which is programmer slang for no operation. So whatever coordinates you give us that you want to transform, we're just going to spin them right back out and not shift them. And if you don't care that much about accuracy, that's fine. They're pretty close. But if we take a look at after NADCON5, we see a much longer, much scarier looking proj pipeline. And it has, as you can see here, this grid shift step. And what that's going to do is load in a grid, one of those grids that I talked about, and it will use that to adjust the transformation. And I've taken a few grid shifts out of this. There's, I think, 4 or 5 total. But with all that, we get some much more accurate transformations. So how much of a difference does this really make? In the testing that I did, going from NAD83 to NAD83 2011 and the different realizations of it, we can see shifts of, I tested out a few different state planes, but shifts of upwards of 0.5 meter here. So that starts to add up when you're talking about centimeters. And that is what is responsible for that, for the mismatch that we saw. So you can see even with NAD83 and sticking to static datums, there's complexity there too. And NAD27 to NAD83 is even worse. It's much worse than this. So the gotcha here is that, as I said, the NADCON5 grids were only released in 2016, and they weren't added in GIS software until quite recently. In the open source realm, you have to be running Proj 9.2 or later, which was just released last year. After some brief testing I did, I don't work with ArcGIS much, or really at all. But after a bit of testing and searching around, it seems like these new NADCON5 grids are only supported in ArcGIS Pro 3.2 or later. And even then, they need to be manually installed. So, if you're on a version of ArcGIS Pro prior to 3.2, either upgrade or stick to